That morning, the Florida courtroom was packed into the hallway. It was not a celebrity trial, but a woman claiming her sister stole half her fortune. She cried beautifully, almost convincing everyone I was a cold thief who swallowed the family assets. Eventually, I simply handed over a slim cream envelope. The judge read it and laughed in her face. It was the laugh of someone realizing a liar signed her own trap years ago. I am McKinley Silva. I am 38 years old, and I sit perfectly still at the heavy wooden defense table inside the Palm Crescent County Civil Court. The air conditioning in the large room struggles against the humid Florida heat, but the chill at my table has absolutely nothing to do with the temperature. I keep my posture straight, my shoulders squared, and my expression entirely blank. This is not just any standard civil dispute. It is a full-blown spectacle. The gallery behind me is overflowing to the point where people are standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Local reporters with their audio recorders, old family acquaintances hungry for gossip, and wealthy vultures from the Gulf business circle are all here. They have gathered to watch a multi-million-dollar empire get sliced open under the harsh fluorescent lights of the justice system. We are talking about massive corporate shares, prime coastal real estate spanning hundreds of acres, and a highly guarded family trust that has been sealed tight for several years. Across the center aisle sits the plaintiff, Aubrey Silva, my older sister. She is dressed in a soft beige silk blouse and perfectly tailored trousers, looking far more prepared for an exclusive primetime television interview than a brutal, mud-slinging legal battle. Her makeup is flawless, but deliberately muted to give her the fragile, exhausted look of a woman who has endured unimaginable hardship. She dabs the corner of her eye with a tissue, a gesture perfectly timed for the sketch artists and reporters sitting in the back row. She knows exactly where the cameras are, even in a room where cameras are forbidden. The low murmur of the crowd falls completely silent when Aubrey stands up. She does not just want the remaining family inheritance, she wants blood. Her voice trembles with practiced vulnerability when she addresses the room. She boldly claims she is entitled to exactly one half of my personal wealth, demanding a 50% stake in everything I own. Every single dollar McKinley has, Aubrey says, letting a single tear slip down her cheek at the perfect moment. Every company she built, every coastal property she bought, every investment portfolio she manages, it was all built on the family foundation. Our parents' foundation. The foundation she cunningly stole from me when I was not looking. The crowd shifts eagerly in their seats. You can hear the rapid scratch of pens on paper and the hushed, excited whispers of the gallery. This is exactly the dramatic narrative they came to hear today. The tragic tale of the poor, ousted older sister, whose bright future was ruthlessly stolen by the wealthy, calculating younger sibling. Aubrey knows how to play a room better than anyone I have ever met. She spent her entire life performing, bending the truth to fit her needs, and this courtroom is just her latest, grandest stage. Her lawyer, a theatrical man with a booming voice named Richard Vance, paces dramatically in front of the judge's bench. He begins painting a devastatingly emotional picture for the record. He describes me as the golden child who turned rogue. He spins a vivid, horrifying tale of how I supposedly hovered over our ailing parents during their final years, controlling their medical appointments, filtering their phone calls, screening their visitors, and ultimately, taking hostile control of their bank accounts. He uses heavy words like manipulation, coercion, undue influence, and elder abuse, tossing them into the air like poisoned darts meant to destroy my reputation. According to his loud declarations, I use sophisticated, deeply unethical financial maneuvers to bleed the Silva family trust dry and funnel the assets directly into my own private holding companies. I listen to every single word he says. I do not flinch. I do not shake my head in denial. I do not look away from him. My lead defense attorney sits quietly beside me, equally calm, taking precise notes on a yellow legal pad. The whispers in the gallery grow louder, commenting on my complete lack of reaction. I hear someone 2 rows back mutter that I look like a block of ice. To the untrained eye, My absolute silence might look like the arrogance of a guilty woman who thinks she is above the law. But anyone who truly understands power, anyone who deals in hard facts and ironclad contracts, knows the truth. This is not the silence of fear. It is the absolute, unshakable quiet of someone who holds a winning hand and is simply waiting for the opponent to push all their chips blindly into the center of the table. Judge Harold Wainwright leans heavily forward, his dark robes shifting around his shoulders. He is a stern man with decades of judicial experience and zero patience for courtroom theatrics. He adjusts his reading glasses and glares down at Aubrey's legal team with a look that could curdle milk. "Counselor," Judge Wainwright says, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy, tense air of the room. "These speeches are wonderful for the evening news broadcasts, but we are in a court of law, not a theater. You have made catastrophic allegations regarding a fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. I expect you to produce the paper trail right now. Present your evidence. Mr. Vance?" Aubrey's lawyer nods eagerly, unfazed by the judge's sharp tone. He walks briskly back to his table and brings forward his so-called smoking guns. He hands the court clerk a remarkably thin stack of papers. The clerk passes them up to the high wooden bench. It is almost comical to watch. The grand damning evidence they promised consists merely of a few scattered printouts of old, entirely out of context emails between family members. There are some glossy photographs of our childhood home, pictures of our parents looking frail in their garden, and holiday cards. Aubrey then takes the witness stand to provide a tearful, heartbreaking testimony about how she always felt pushed out of the inner family circle, how our mother stopped answering her calls, and how our father looked at her with disappointment. It is an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation, but to anyone who understands the law, it severely lacks any structural or legal backbone. There are no independent forensic audits submitted to the court. There are no banking statements showing illicit, hidden transfers. There are no signed legal documents proving coercion or fraud. There is only Aubrey's manufactured pain, beautifully packaged, tied with a bow of victimhood, and presented for maximum public sympathy. Judge Wainwright flips through the pitiful, thin stack of papers, his thick eyebrows knit together in visible, growing annoyance. He looks at the glossy holiday photos, then at the printed emails complaining about dinner plans, and finally down at Aubrey, who is still weeping softly and beautifully on the wooden witness stand. I watch her perform from my seat, feeling absolutely nothing. The anger I used to feel toward her burned out a very long time ago. Now, there is only the cold, sterile execution of reality. Aubrey genuinely believes she can win a complex legal war using the exact same emotional tantrums that used to force our parents into giving her whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. She firmly thinks the justice system will bend to her tears, just because our mother always did. My hands rest softly and evenly on the polished mahogany table in front of me. Just to my right, resting against the sturdy leg of the table, sits my heavy black leather briefcase. The brass clasps are tightly closed. Inside that briefcase, tucked securely into a hidden side pocket, is a single, sealed cream-colored envelope. I have not opened it. I have not even pulled it out of the bag yet. But my right hand drops down, and my fingertips brush against the thick leather exactly where the envelope rests inside. The physical gesture is incredibly small, completely unnoticeable to the hungry reporters behind me and the weeping sister across the room. I keep my hand perfectly still over that specific spot on the leather. It feels exactly like a seasoned soldier, resting her quiet fingers lightly against the safety catch of her final, most destructive weapon, patiently waiting for the absolute perfect moment to pull the trigger. I did not wake up one morning, stretch my arms, and miraculously find myself surrounded by a massive corporate fortune. The entire narrative my sister is currently attempting to sell to the judge heavily relies on the convenient illusion that I am merely a lucky trust fund baby who quietly intercepted our parents' wealth while they were looking the other way. The reality of my bank accounts is far less glamorous and infinitely more exhausting than her fictional tragedy. I am not a lottery winner. I am a woman who spent the better part of 2 decades building an ironclad financial fortress brick by heavy brick. Right after I graduated from the university, I did not take a gap year to travel across Europe. I did not ask our parents for a seed capital loan to pursue a fragile passion project. Instead, I put on heavy work boots and walked straight into the headquarters of Silva Restoration Group. That was the original business our parents built from nothing. A specialized contracting firm focused entirely on commercial recovery after catastrophic hurricanes swept through the southern coastal states. During my early 20s, my office was not a quiet, air-conditioned suite on the top floor of a glass building. My office was the chaotic, mold-smelling command center of whichever city had just been leveled by a Category 4 storm. While other young professionals were attending networking mixers, I was sitting under flickering fluorescent lights at 2 o'clock in the morning, reading through dense, 50-page commercial insurance policies. I learned exactly how to sit across a folding table from aggressive corporate banking adjusters and ruthlessly negotiate bridge loans so local manufacturing plants could keep their payrolls funded while they waited for federal emergency relief checks. I learned the most vital lesson of the corporate world very early on. You survive by the numbers, and you perish by your emotions. Empathy is a lovely human trait, but it does not clear debris, it does not rebuild supply chains, and it absolutely does not prevent bankruptcy. I trained myself to look at devastation and instantly calculate the exact mathematical equation required to fix it. To the general public, commercial disaster recovery was a dirty, dry, and thoroughly unappealing industry. People saw the shattered glass, the flooded drywall, and the ruined inventory, but looking at the wreckage, I saw something completely different. I saw pure, unfiltered leverage. A major logistics company will aggressively haggle over a $5,000 landscaping bill on a normal sunny Tuesday. But that exact same company will not hesitate to wire you $2 million in cash if you can guarantee their regional distribution center will be fully operational within 48 hours after a natural disaster. Companies will gladly pay an absolute premium to the person who can guarantee their survival. I realized that risk mitigation was not just a cleanup service. It was the most lucrative sector in the modern economy. Armed with that specific realization, I made a decision that fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. I walked away from the family business. I did not ask for a severance package. I did not ask for a minority stake in our parents' company. I severed my professional ties cleanly and founded my own independent firm. I called it Verity Harbor Analytics. I transitioned away from physical disaster recovery and moved entirely into the digital space of predictive risk. I hired a team of brilliant developers to build a proprietary software platform capable of tracking real-time supply chain vulnerabilities, monitoring global insurance compliance, and managing automated financial triggers for multinational logistics networks. Building Verity Harbor. Analytics was not a smooth cinematic journey. For the first 4 years, I worked 90 hours a week. I poured every single dollar of my personal savings into server costs and payroll. I pitched my software to venture capitalists who laughed and offered me terrible deals, demanding 50% of my company for a fraction of its true value. I rejected all of them. I kept my equity tight and pushed forward until the software became an indispensable tool for the biggest shipping companies on the eastern seaboard. A few years ago, the inevitable happened. A highly aggressive private equity firm based out of New York recognized the absolute dominance of our analytics platform. They flew down to Florida and placed a staggering valuation on the table. After 6 months of brutal negotiations, I sold a 30% minority stake in Verity Harbor Analytics. The cash from that single transaction instantly made me a remarkably wealthy woman long before I turned 40 years old. Despite the massive influx of capital, my lifestyle remained aggressively boring. I did not buy a sprawling mansion in Miami. I did not purchase a fleet of luxury cars. I did not throw extravagant parties to show off my new net worth. I quietly and methodically reinvested the capital into secure municipal bonds, conservative index funds, and a portfolio of heavily vetted, unglamorous commercial properties that generated steady, reliable yields. I kept my social circle exceptionally small, and my financial footprint entirely invisible to the public eye. I made absolutely certain that my legal and financial walls were impenetrable. When I set up Verity Harbor Analytics, I hired an entirely separate legal team from the one our parents used. I refused to even use the same commercial bank branch as the Silva Restoration Group just to ensure there could never be a single accusation of commingled funds. If I needed to buy a software license, the money came from my own pocket. If I needed to hire a new data analyst, I covered the payroll taxes from the revenue my company generated. At absolutely no point in the history of my company did a single dollar from the Silva Family Trust ever cross over into my operating accounts. My corporate lawyers built a firewall so thick and so legally binding that no standard civil lawsuit could ever hope to breach it. When the private equity buyout occurred, the due diligence process was incredibly invasive. They sent a team of forensic accountants to scrub every single financial transaction my company had ever made since the day it was incorporated. They spent 3 months looking for hidden liabilities, undisclosed loans, or messy family entanglements. They found absolutely nothing but clean, meticulously organized corporate governance. That pristine record is exactly why they paid tens of millions of dollars for a minority stake. My wealth is a matter of public corporate record, heavily documented, fiercely protected, and entirely self-generated. Our parents knew this perfectly well. Before their health began to fail, they watched me build my empire from the sidelines. They would frequently tell their close friends, their attorneys, and their financial advisors that I was the only person in the entire Silva bloodline who truly understood both the complex mechanics of money and the crushing, lonely responsibility that comes with protecting it. They deeply respected the rigid boundaries I drew between my business and the family trust. During a quiet dinner a few years before our father passed away, he looked at me across the table and told me that wealth is a completely neutral tool. It has no morals. It only amplifies the true nature of the person holding it. He told me that he slept peacefully at night, knowing that whatever money I touched would be managed with absolute precision and respect. He recognized that I viewed capital as a strict responsibility, not a magical solution to personal unhappiness. This stark contrast between reality and the fictional narrative being spun in this courtroom is exactly what makes the current situation so incredibly volatile. The sheer audacity of the lawsuit is breathtaking. I have laid out a perfectly verifiable history of independence. My entire fortune is insulated by audited corporate filings, ironclad private equity contracts, and federal tax returns that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I built my empire alone. Yet, my sister sits mere feet away from me, surrounded by high-priced litigation attorneys, boldly demanding half of a kingdom she has never even set foot in. If my corporate holdings, my investment portfolios, and my coastal properties are entirely my own, supported by mountains of audited financial evidence and independent legal structures, a massive question hangs over this entire proceeding. Why would my sister confidently walk into a court of law and demand 50% of my life's work as if it is her undeniable right? What massive hidden delusion gives her the courage to attack a financial fortress she knows she never helped build? Aubrey is exactly 3 years older than I am, but she has spent her entire adult life demanding to be treated like a fragile child who simply needs one more chance to get things right. If you were to meet her at a charity gala or a networking luncheon, you would be instantly captivated. She is undeniably beautiful, possessing that effortless, sun-kissed coastal elegance that takes hours and thousands of dollars to perfect. She is incredibly articulate, charming, and possesses an uncanny ability to make whoever she is speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. Aubrey is an absolute master of the first impression. Her fatal flaw, however, is that she is entirely addicted to the aesthetic of success rather than the actual, grueling work required to achieve it. For as long as I can remember, my sister has chased the intoxicating high of a grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony, only to completely abandon the building the moment the plumbing backed up or the payroll taxes were due. She never wanted to build a business. She only wanted to step into the role of a successful founder after all the dirty, unglamorous foundation work was somehow magically finished for her. Her professional resume reads like a chaotic tour of high-end retail failures. In her late 20s, she opened an upscale fashion boutique in a wildly expensive commercial district. For the first 90 days, it was a spectacular show of imported champagne, local magazine features, and racks of overpriced silk garments. By the 6th month, she was drowning in unpaid vendor invoices because she fundamentally refused to learn how to manage inventory or balance a ledger. When the boutique inevitably folded, she smoothly pivoted into a bespoke event planning studio. Again, the branding was absolutely immaculate, but she routinely forgot to pay the caterers and florists, leaving behind a trail of furious local contractors. Then came the artisanal cocktail lounge, which featured celebrity mixologists but somehow lacked the proper municipal liquor licenses to operate legally. After the lounge was shuttered by city inspectors, she launched a boutique personal branding agency for local minor celebrities. Every single one of these grand ventures followed the exact same catastrophic trajectory. They were shiny and aggressively promoted for 3 months, and then they collapsed under the weight of her sheer administrative incompetence. Every single time the walls started caving in, our parents were the ones standing by with the safety net. They loved her, and because they loved her, they funded her delusions. They quietly paid off her maxed-out credit cards so her credit score would not tank. They wrote massive checks to cover her commercial leases so she would not be sued by angry commercial landlords. They hired high-priced accountants to clean up the horrifying tax liabilities she left behind when she simply stopped filing her quarterly returns. There was even a terrifying month where the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on her luxury beachfront condominium because she had simply ignored her mortgage payments for half a year. Our father had to wire an exorbitant sum of cash on a Tuesday afternoon just to keep a roof over her head. The truly remarkable thing was Aubrey's reaction to being saved. A normal person would feel a crushing sense of guilt or at least profound gratitude. Aubrey felt neither. To her, every single bailout was simply a confirmation of her twisted worldview. She firmly believed that because she was family, the universe, and by extension our parents, owed her a frictionless existence. She viewed their hard-earned money not as a generous gift, but as an endless communal well that she had an inherent right to drink from whenever she felt thirsty. It is precisely this deeply ingrained entitlement that allows her to look at my independently earned assets today and see them as a shared family pool that she is somehow being unjustly denied access to. This bitter resentment did not appear overnight. It was cultivated over decades. When we were children, our parents would frequently praise my quiet persistence. If I started a difficult puzzle, I would sit at the dining table for hours until it was finished. If Aubrey started a puzzle and could not find the corner pieces immediately, she would sweep the entire thing onto the floor and demand a new game. She has always deeply resented me for that difference. She does not hate me because I am wealthy. She hates me because my existence proves a very cruel, unavoidable truth about the world. I am living proof that true success does not require dramatic flair, a curated personality, or a tragic backstory. It simply requires relentless, boring, unyielding discipline. My financial stability makes her chaotic string of failures look exactly like what they are: bad choices. She cannot blame bad luck when her own sister grew up in the exact same house and managed to build an empire simply by putting her head down and doing the actual work. The seeds of this current lawsuit were planted a few years ago, right after the regional business journals published a glowing feature about the massive private equity investment in my analytics firm. I kept my head down, but the numbers were public enough to turn heads in our social circles. Instead of congratulating me, Aubrey went on a subtle, calculated offensive. At country club lunches and weekend dinner parties, she began casually dropping entirely fabricated remarks to our mutual acquaintances. She would sip her wine and sigh, telling her friends that it was such a blessing our parents had provided the initial seed money for my tech company. She started narrating a completely fictional history where my software empire was actually built on the silent financial backing of the Silva family estate. She was planting the seeds of a false narrative, meticulously laying the groundwork for the exact story she is currently tearfully delivering to the judge. The true depth of her cold calculation was exposed during the darkest period of our family's history. When our father passed away after a prolonged battle with heart failure, the entire family was completely shattered. I spent weeks organizing the funeral, handling the hospital bills, and managing the suffocating grief. Aubrey, true to form, treated the funeral like a tragic networking event, wearing a perfectly tailored black designer dress and accepting condolences with practiced grace. 2 years later, when our mother passed away from a sudden stroke, the silence in our childhood home was absolutely deafening. We were sitting in the living room with our extended relatives, the air thick with sorrow. Most of us were quietly weeping, sharing memories, and trying to process the finality of losing the last pillar of our family. Aubrey was sitting in the corner armchair. She did not have a tissue. Her eyes were completely dry. Instead of offering comfort, she looked directly at the family attorney who had stopped by to pay his respects and asked the single most chilling question I have ever heard. She did not ask about the burial arrangements. She did not ask about our mother's final moments. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and perfectly steady, and asked, "So exactly what is in whose name now?" The room went dead silent. Our aunts and uncles stared at her in absolute, unmasked horror. It was a question so incredibly cold, so devoid of any human empathy, that several of our relatives still bring it up in hushed whispers to this day. In that precise moment, any lingering illusion I had about my sister being a misunderstood, struggling artist completely evaporated. Sitting here in this courtroom, watching her dab her dry eyes for the gallery, a profound realization settles over me. Aubrey is not suing me because she genuinely believes she has been financially wronged. She does not actually want fairness. Fairness would mean taking responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of dollars she already drained from our parents. What she truly wants is to fundamentally rewrite the history of our lives. She wants the court, the public, and the media to validate her delusion. If she can legally prove that my money is actually family money, then she is no longer a chronic failure who squandered every opportunity she was ever handed. Instead, she becomes the tragic heroine, the rightful heir who was merely cheated out of her destiny by a greedy younger sister. She is not trying to steal my money. She is desperately trying to buy a completely new past, using my life's work as the currency. Our parents did not build a highly successful commercial recovery empire by making critical financial decisions based purely on warm sentimentality. They were fundamentally pragmatic people. They understood risk, liability, and the devastating consequences of poorly drafted contracts. They loved us both deeply, but they possessed the rare, clear-eyed ability to separate their unconditional parental love from the cold, hard realities of estate planning. They knew exactly who my sister was, and more importantly, they knew exactly what she was capable of destroying if left unchecked. The turning point for their estate strategy occurred several years ago, right after Aubrey managed to orchestrate her most terrifying financial disaster to date. She had attempted to secure an enormous, multi-year commercial lease for a luxury wellness retreat that existed only in her imagination and on a few glossy presentation boards. Desperate to get the property management group to approve her application, she secretly listed our parents' main holding company as the primary corporate guarantor on the lease without their knowledge or consent. When the deal inevitably imploded before the doors even opened, the landlord threatened to execute the guarantee and liquidate our parents' commercial assets to cover the broken lease. Our father had to deploy his most aggressive litigation attorneys to sever the liability, costing him tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees just to untangle the fraudulent mess. That specific incident shattered whatever remaining illusions our parents held about Aubrey, eventually maturing into a responsible adult. It became terrifyingly clear that leaving her a massive, unstructured pile of cash would not be a gift. It would be an absolute death sentence for her future and a catastrophic risk to the family legacy. They immediately hired a specialized team of wealth managers and high-net-worth estate lawyers to build an impenetrable fortress around the remaining family wealth. They established the Silva Legacy Trust. It was not a simple, passive bank account. It was a highly sophisticated, active legal entity designed to generate perpetual income while strictly limiting access to the principal capital. The trust held the title to several prime commercial real estate properties that generated substantial monthly rental income. It held the remaining corporate shares of the original disaster recovery business, along with a deeply conservative, heavily diversified investment portfolio of municipal bonds and blue-chip index funds. The governance structure of this trust was engineered to be exceptionally rigid. The rights to manage, sell, or leverage any of the underlying assets were locked behind a series of complex legal gates. However, the most brilliant and devastatingly effective mechanism our parents implemented was their strict legal categorization of Aubrey. Because they had already spent years bailing her out of ruined boutiques, shuttered cocktail lounges, and unpaid tax liabilities, the estate attorneys advised them to change how those bailouts were classified. They stopped treating the money as random gifts. From that point forward, every single dollar they spent rescuing Aubrey was officially categorized as an advancement against her future inheritance. This was not just a verbal warning, it was a meticulously documented administrative ritual. Every single time our parents had to pay off her overflowing credit cards, every time they had to inject emergency capital to stop a vendor lawsuit, and every time they covered her delinquent property taxes, they forced her to sign a formal legal receipt. The family attorneys drafted specific addendums for every rescue operation. Aubrey had to sit down in a wood-paneled office, pick up a pen, and sign a notarized document expressly acknowledging that the exact sum of money she was receiving that day was being permanently deducted from her final share of the Silva estate. The lawyers kept these signed receipts in thick, heavy leather binders, building an undeniable paper trail of her financial consumption. The absolute climax of this legal strategy occurred during a highly tense, mandatory family meeting exactly 2 years before our mother passed away. Our father was already gone, and our mother, knowing her health was rapidly declining, wanted to close all the remaining financial loops. We gathered in the grand conference room of the family law firm. Aubrey sat across from me, furiously tapping her designer heel against the carpet, radiating impatient annoyance. She was currently drowning in the debts of another spectacular business failure, this time a high-end corporate event planning service, and she desperately needed a massive, immediate injection of cash to avoid personal bankruptcy. The lead estate attorney slid a thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table toward her. Our mother looked at Aubrey and delivered a crystal-clear, non-negotiable ultimatum. Aubrey had 2 distinct choices. Option 1 was to refuse the documents, keep her legal right to dispute the final distribution of the family trust after our mother died, but receive absolutely zero financial assistance today, ensuring her immediate bankruptcy. Option 2 was to accept a massive, final lump sum of cash right then and there to wipe out her current debts. But in exchange for that immediate financial rescue, she had to sign an ironclad, permanent waiver explicitly surrendering all future claims, rights, and demands to any remaining assets within the Silva Legacy Trust. Aubrey did not even hesitate. She firmly believed that she absolutely needed the immediate cash flow to save her sinking project and preserve her public image. She practically snatched the expensive pen from the attorney. But before she could sign, the lawyer forced her to listen as he read the stipulations aloud for the official record. The agreement was comprehensive and brutal. It clearly stated that she was accepting this final cash disbursement in lieu of any future inheritance. Furthermore, a specific, highly detailed clause had been drafted explicitly regarding my personal assets. Because I had spent years providing free, high-level administrative and operational management to the family trust, using my own time and resources to optimize their tax strategies without ever taking a salary, the document needed to clarify the boundaries. The agreement explicitly confirmed, legally and permanently, that the wealth I had generated through my independent technology firm, Verity Harbor Analytics, and all of my subsequent personal investments were entirely separate from the family estate. The document stated that under no circumstances could my personal holdings ever be classified, perceived, or legally challenged as family assets. Aubrey sat there, staring at the wall, barely paying attention to the intricate legal terminology. To her, the thick stack of papers was just a minor, annoying obstacle standing between her and the wire transfer she desperately needed to fund her lifestyle. She signed her name on every single dotted line with quick, aggressive strokes of the pen. She did not ask questions. She did not consult her own counsel, even though one was sitting right next to her. She just wanted the money, and she wanted to leave the boring, suffocating room. Because she signed the document so hastily, so aggressively, and with such overwhelming arrogance, the actual gravity of what she had legally surrendered never registered in her mind. Over the years, as her memories faded and her resentment toward my success grew, she slowly and thoroughly convinced herself that the massive legal waiver she signed in that conference room was simply a meaningless formality. She convinced herself it was just an old piece of paper that did not matter anymore because our parents were gone. She fundamentally forgot that the law does not care about her selective memory, her feelings, or her personal reinterpretations of history. As I sit here in the courtroom today, listening to her weave a masterful, tearful tale of being violently robbed of her rightful family legacy, the sheer magnitude of her delusion is almost breathtaking. She truly believes that her tears and her emotional narrative can somehow magically erase the rigid legal structures our parents spent years building. She thinks the past can be rewritten simply because she wants it to be. But the past is not written in tears. It is written in ink. It is stamped by notaries, witnessed by attorneys, and bound in legal files. And as I feel the slight pressure of the thick leather briefcase resting against my leg, I know exactly what is waiting in the dark. The audience in the gallery thinks they are watching a story about stolen wealth. They have absolutely no idea that the real story is about a woman who gleefully sold her own future for immediate gratification, and the heavy, cream-colored envelope that is about to remind her exactly what her signature looks like. The trial did not genuinely begin when the judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block this morning. The actual warfare commenced a full 30 days before any official legal complaint was ever physically stamped by the county clerk. My sister and her aggressively theatrical legal counsel executed a highly sophisticated and deeply malicious media strike. They bypassed the standard professional courtesy of serving a private notice of intent. Instead, they strategically leaked the entire fabricated narrative of their impending lawsuit to two prominent local digital lifestyle blogs and a notoriously sensationalized morning radio broadcast that thrives on dissecting the scandals of wealthy Gulf Coast families. The very first article dropped on a Tuesday morning, hitting the internet just as the local business community was settling in with their coffee. It was a masterclass in character assassination. The piece did not contain outright, legally actionable lies, which was precisely the most insidious aspect of their entire strategy. Instead, it weaponized the truth through deliberate and malicious arrangement. The bold, oversized headline was meticulously designed for maximum clickbait destruction. It read exactly like a soap opera script, announcing that a millionaire technology founder was being accused by her own biological sister of ruthlessly manipulating their sick, elderly parents to swallow the entire family fortune. The article carefully highlighted the massive valuation of my private equity deal and juxtaposed those impressive corporate figures directly against incredibly personal, intimate photographs of our parents looking frail and exhausted in their final days. The implication was heavy, toxic, and immediately damaging. Within a mere 72 hours, I was forcefully dragged out of my fiercely protected anonymity. I went from being a respected, fiercely private corporate executive to an unwilling public villain plastered across local social media feeds. The secure corporate sanctuary I had spent years building at my analytics firm was suddenly breached by cheap tabloid gossip. Senior vice presidents at major international logistics firms, clients who trusted my software with their most highly sensitive supply chain data, began scheduling sudden, unscheduled check-in calls. They danced around the topic politely, but the underlying anxiety was palpable. My own board of directors requested an emergency closed-door meeting to discuss the immediate reputational risk management protocols. I had to sit at the head of a long glass table and assure a room full of nervous private equity investors that my personal family drama would not destabilize our upcoming quarterly earnings projections. While I was exhausting myself fighting corporate fires and actively reassuring shipping partners that my legal standing was absolutely pristine, my sister was busy working the local camera crews. Aubrey fully embraced her self-appointed role as the tragic, abandoned woman fighting against corporate greed. She managed to secure an exclusive, sit-down interview with a regional broadcast network. The production value was sickeningly perfect. She sat on a plush velvet sofa bathed in soft, forgiving lighting, wearing a simple, understated dress that made her look vulnerable. She produced the exact right amount of tears, letting them well up but never quite ruining her makeup. She let her voice tremble beautifully at the end of every single sentence. She looked directly into the camera lens and delivered perfectly rehearsed sound bites, softly claiming that she did not care about the millions of dollars. She swore she only wanted fairness, transparency, and a chance to heal the deep wounds of our broken family. Her televised performance was so utterly convincing, so drenched in manufactured heartbreak, that the tight-knit social circles our parents used to frequent began to fracture almost immediately. Elderly country club members, retired business partners, and old family friends who had absolutely zero access to the actual estate ledgers or the ironclad trust documents were completely swept up in the melodrama. These were people who had known us since childhood, yet they allowed a 5-minute television segment to rewrite their entire perception of me. They did not publicly condemn me to my face, but the toxic whispers started circulating rapidly at charity luncheons and golf course bars. The collective sentiment settled into a highly dangerous assumption. They murmured quietly over their expensive cocktails that where there is smoke, there must be fire. They reasoned amongst themselves that a grieving sister would never endure the humiliation of dragging her own flesh and blood into a brutal public trial unless there was some dark, hidden truth to the terrible accusations. I quickly realized that Aubrey was not actually preparing for a standard legal battle over financial assets. She was launching a precision strike on my professional credibility. In the high-stakes sector of corporate risk analysis, absolute trust and unshakable integrity are the only currencies that truly matter. A ruined reputation would cost me infinitely more than whatever outrageous cash settlement she was ultimately hoping to extort. She was holding my life's work, my company, and my future hostage in the volatile court of public opinion, betting that I would quietly hand over a massive check just to make the embarrassing headlines disappear. I needed a very specific kind of weapon to fight back against this media circus. I completely bypassed the loud, aggressive television lawyers who promised to fight fire with fire. Instead, I retained Graham Vale. He is a senior litigation partner at the highly respected firm of Vale Mercer, LLP. Graham is not a man who shouts. He does not give flashy press conferences on the courthouse steps. He does not leak quotes to journalists, and he absolutely despises courtroom theatrics. He is a man who speaks softly, wears impeccably tailored dark suits, and destroys opposing counsel with terrifying precision. He is notoriously lethal in complex civil disputes, precisely because he dismantles emotionally charged, narrative-driven lawsuits with the cold, crushing discipline of hard documentary evidence. During our very first strategy meeting, I was pacing the hardwood floor of his corner office, visibly radiating anger. I was venting about the latest tabloid hit piece that had just accused me of locking our mother in her bedroom to steal her jewelry. I demanded that we issue a fierce public denial and file immediate defamation suits against the bloggers. Graham remained perfectly still behind his massive oak desk. He let me finish my entire angry tirade before calmly pouring me a cup of black coffee and sliding it across the desk. He looked at me with an expression of absolute, unshakable calm and delivered a sentence that completely rewired my approach to the entire ordeal. He told me that people do not need to win their battles in the newspapers if they have already unequivocally lost the war on paper. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together, and explained that reacting to the media bait would only feed the exact frenzy my sister was trying to sustain. We did not need to convince the morning radio hosts or the country club gossips. He said we just need to let the court see exactly who is acting for the cameras and who is actually proving their case with the law. That single piece of advice anchored me, transforming my burning anger into a cold, highly focused anticipation. For the moment the heavy doors of the courtroom would finally swing closed behind us. While Aubrey was busy crying on morning television broadcasts, Graham Vale was aggressively transforming a massive, windowless conference room in the basement of his law firm into an absolute fortress of information. He did not issue a single public statement. He did not draft a single press release to counter her malicious narrative. Instead, he simply ordered his paralegals to start building what he affectionately referred to as the war room. The sheer physical volume of our counterattack was staggering. We covered the long mahogany tables with decades of pristine financial history. We had heavy banker boxes filled with certified bank records, thousands of pages of monthly investment statements, heavily bound family meeting minutes, printed archives of old digital correspondence, high-resolution scans of notarized signatures, and a perfectly chronological ledger of every single wire transfer that had ever moved into or out of the Silva family accounts over the past 15 years. To completely annihilate Aubrey's central legal argument regarding commingled funds, Graham brought in an independent forensic auditor. She was a terrifyingly brilliant woman who had spent 20 years dismantling complex corporate fraud cases for federal agencies. She was tasked with digitally reconstructing the entire financial border separating the Silva Legacy Trust from my personal corporate accounts. For 3 straight weeks, she sat in the corner of the war room, her eyes locked on multiple glowing monitors, tracing every single penny I had ever earned, invested, or spent since the exact day I walked away from the family business. The final audit report she delivered was a masterpiece of financial clarity. It was cleaner and far more devastating than even Graham had initially anticipated. Not only did the report definitively prove that I had never used a single cent of our parents' money to build my technology firm, but it uncovered a profoundly ironic transaction that we had almost forgotten about. 4 years ago, the Silva Legacy Trust experienced a severe temporary liquidity crisis due to a highly complicated municipal tax reassessment on one of their largest coastal commercial properties. Instead of letting the trust liquidate a highly profitable index fund to cover the sudden tax bill, I stepped in. I personally provided the family trust with a short-term commercial bridge loan from my own private accounts. The forensic auditor found the exact executed contract in the archives. It was a formal, legally binding agreement complete with a standard market interest rate of 7%, and the family trust had repaid me in full exactly 9 months later. I had not been bleeding the family empire dry. I had been the one quietly acting as their emergency bank. Once the defensive perimeter around my wealth was absolutely secured by the forensic audit, Graham shifted his formidable legal machinery onto the offensive. He deployed a team of private investigators to dig deeply into Aubrey's current financial reality. We needed to understand exactly why she was launching this desperate, suicidal legal strike right now. The answer was buried under a mountain of catastrophic, high-interest debt. Aubrey was actively drowning. The investigators pulled public records and uncovered a horrifying web of financial ruin. She had completely maxed out 6 different premium credit cards. She was defaulting on 2 separate commercial business loans. There were multiple aggressive collection orders filed by angry vendors, caterers, and florists who had never been paid for her latest disastrous venture, a ridiculously overpriced luxury event planning syndicate that had collapsed spectacularly just 4 months after its grand opening. She was staring directly into the abyss of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but the most explosive piece of leverage did not come from her public debt records. It came from a deep dive into our late mother's digital archives. One of Graham's junior associates was carefully reviewing the email backups of our mother's former wealth advisor when he found a hidden thread. It was a lengthy, highly detailed exchange between Aubrey and the advisor, dated exactly 8 months before she ever filed the lawsuit. In these emails, Aubrey was not acting like a grieving, heartbroken daughter seeking clarity. She was cold, sharp, and highly calculating. She explicitly asked the advisor to outline the specific legal loopholes required to successfully reclassify the massive sums of money our parents had previously spent bailing her out. She wanted to know exactly how to argue in a court of law that those historical payments were merely tax-free gifts of affection, rather than legally binding advancements against her final inheritance. Reading those printed emails in the war room, a cold satisfaction washed over me. This was the ultimate proof of premeditation. Aubrey had not been suddenly blindsided by an unfair distribution of the estate. She had been actively crowdsourcing a fraudulent legal strategy for nearly a year, carefully preparing to rewrite family history long before she ever sat down in front of a television camera to shed her fake tears. However, Graham was not finished. He possessed an uncanny ability to pull on a loose thread until the entire sweater unraveled. While tracking the origins of her recent commercial loans, he uncovered something far more dangerous than simple credit card debt. Aubrey had not just borrowed money from standard commercial banks. Desperate to keep her failing lifestyle afloat, she had secured a massive, highly unregulated cash injection from a private, notoriously aggressive lending syndicate in the neighboring county. To secure that risky capital, she had offered collateral she did not actually possess. She had successfully sold these private lenders a massive lie. She promised them that she was on the absolute verge of receiving a multi-million-dollar inheritance payout from the Silva estate. The entire picture suddenly snapped into terrifying focus. This sensational lawsuit was never truly about sibling rivalry, childhood jealousy, or a genuine desire for family fairness. It was an absolute, panicked act of survival. Aubrey had leveraged a phantom fortune to borrow very real, very dangerous money. Now that the private investors were violently demanding their repayment, she had to manufacture a legitimate reason why her promised inheritance was delayed. Suing me was her only way to buy time and legitimize the massive lie she had sold to her creditors. It was late in the evening when Graham finally closed the heavy, thick binder containing all of our gathered intelligence. The overhead lights in the war room cast long shadows across the mountains of paper. He looked across the table at me, his expression completely unreadable, and delivered a clear, strict directive. He told me that we possessed enough ammunition to completely obliterate her case before the sun came up, but he insisted that we were not going to show our hand just yet. He explained that if we revealed the depth of our knowledge now, her legal team would simply pivot, withdraw, and attempt to reframe their argument before the judge ever heard a word. He wanted her trapped under oath. He instructed me to remain perfectly silent and let her continue to build her magnificent house of cards inside the courtroom. He promised me that the most effective way to destroy a liar is simply to stand back and let them walk so deeply into their own fiction that their very own sworn testimony becomes the heavy steel lock on the trap they built for themselves. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. Aubrey walked down the center aisle wearing a meticulously chosen ivory suit. It was not a sharp, aggressive power suit meant for a corporate boardroom. It was cut from soft, yielding fabric that draped loosely around her frame, deliberately designed to make her look incredibly fragile and overwhelmed by the massive, intimidating architecture of the legal system. She kept her chin tucked slightly down, her eyes wide and perfectly damp. She was acutely aware of the multiple audiences she was playing to simultaneously. She was not just testifying for Judge Wainwright, who sat high above us with a face like carved granite. She was performing a highly choreographed tragedy for the reporters sketching frantically in the back rows, for the local bloggers updating their live feeds, and for the public gallery hanging on to her every practiced sigh. When she finally took the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth, her voice was a breathy, trembling whisper. It was a calculated volume that forced every single person in the room to lean forward in their rigid wooden seats, just to hear her. Under the gentle, guiding questions of her lead attorney, Richard Vance, she completely ignored the complex financial realities of the family trust. Instead, she spun a devastatingly sad narrative of emotional exile and systemic sibling replacement. She told the court that from the time we were 10 and 13 years old, Our parents had clearly anointed me as the sole golden successor to the family legacy. She painted herself as the creative, passionate, but deeply misunderstood outcast who was systematically pushed to the extreme margins of our family dynamic. According to her tearful, uninterrupted testimony, every time I stayed late at the kitchen table learning how to read profit and loss statements with our father, it was not an education. It was a calculated move to alienate her. The entire lawsuit suddenly stopped being a dry, technical dispute over corporate assets, holding companies, and real estate deeds. Under her masterful storytelling, it morphed into a deeply painful, universally relatable drama about toxic family favoritism and the crushing weight of parental disappointment. Richard Vance brilliantly avoided bringing up any specific dollar amounts or heavy financial ledgers during his direct examination. He knew those cold numbers would instantly ruin the warm, emotional illusion they were building. Instead, he hammered a single insidious point into the minds of everyone listening. He focused entirely on the final 3 years of our parents' lives, the years when their health was failing and they were most physically and emotionally vulnerable. He painted a terrifying picture of me as the ultimate, cold-blooded gatekeeper. He asked Aubrey leading, emotionally loaded questions about how I managed their doctor's appointments. He asked how I was allegedly the only one allowed to review the incoming hospital bills. He prompted her to describe, through choked sobs, how I supposedly isolated them from her loving, desperate visits by claiming they were simply too tired to see anyone. It was a masterfully toxic performance, and it was undeniably working. Sitting completely still at the defense table, I could actually feel the temperature and the mood in the gallery behind me shifting violently. The low, buzzing whispers of the crowd were no longer neutral observations. A few elderly women sitting in the second row, women who used to play tennis with our mother, were actually nodding in deep sympathy as Aubrey dabbed her eyes with a white cotton handkerchief. I heard a sharp intake of breath from a local business reporter when Vance boldly suggested that I had used my undeniable operational brilliance not to build my own independent company, but as a ruthless, clinical tool to quietly suffocate my sister out of the family bloodline. They were completely buying into the horrifying idea that my extreme administrative competence was actually a weapon of mass financial destruction used against my own flesh and blood. When it was finally time for the cross-examination, Graham Vale stood up from our table. He did not aggressively adjust his tie. He did not look angry, flustered, or intimidated by the heavy emotional atmosphere in the room. He looked entirely bored. He walked to the wooden podium with a single, incredibly thin yellow legal pad. He did not attack her emotional narrative. He completely ignored the tears streaming down her face. He simply began asking a series of incredibly dry, mundane, and seemingly disconnected questions. Graham asked her if she recalled a specific Tuesday in early April, roughly 15 years ago. He asked if she remembered the exact square footage of the luxury fashion boutique she had leased on Ocean Avenue. He politely inquired about a specific wire transfer sent on the 12th of November, asking if she remembered the exact amount required to stop the foreclosure proceedings on her beachfront condominium before the bank locked the doors. He asked about the specific routing numbers used when our mother quietly paid off a massive, deeply delinquent federal tax penalty on her behalf to keep her out of federal court. Aubrey blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden, jarring shift from high emotional drama to boring accounting trivia. She shifted uncomfortably in the heavy wooden chair, her posture losing a fraction of its delicate grace. Her answers became slippery, evasive, and incredibly vague. She repeatedly used the phrase, "I simply cannot recall the exact dates." When Graham gently but firmly pressed her on the massive 6-figure transfer that saved her condo from the bank, she defensively snapped that it was merely a loving gift from a mother to a daughter in need. She wildly conflated the concepts of parental charity with legally binding debt. She attempted to argue to the judge that because our parents had infinite resources, helping her was just their basic, unspoken duty. She completely sidestepped the rigid legal boundaries of the trust, trying to brush away hundreds of thousands of dollars as if they were simply allowances given to a teenager. She was trying to play an emotional game of checkers while Graham was meticulously setting up the final, devastating pieces of a grandmaster chessboard. He never raised his voice, but every question he asked quietly laid another invisible brick in the wall he was building around her. When Judge Wainwright finally struck his heavy gavel and adjourned the court exactly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy tension in the room did not dissipate. It lingered in the air like thick smoke. As the gallery slowly emptied, the reporters rushing out to file their dramatic evening summaries, I remained seated at the defense table, staring at the empty witness stand. A terrifying, deeply unsettling realization washed over me in the quiet courtroom. Aubrey did not actually have to win the legal argument to completely destroy me. If we simply looked at the surface-level optics of the day, she had already inflicted massive, perhaps irreparable, collateral damage. Even if the judge ultimately dismissed her frivolous claims based on the total lack of hard documentary evidence, the damage to the public record would be permanent. She had successfully dragged the clean, honorable memory of our hard-working parents through the mud, painting them as weak, easily manipulated victims who could not control their own household. Worse, she was successfully carving my image into the public consciousness as a brilliant but entirely soulless corporate villain who preyed on her own dying family to enrich herself. In the world of high-stakes corporate data analytics where I operated, trust was everything. If the public believed I could defraud my own mother, no international shipping conglomerate would ever trust my software with their secure financial data again. Winning this trial could no longer be just a quiet, technical dismissal behind closed chamber doors. A simple ruling of insufficient evidence would leave a permanent, toxic cloud of suspicion hovering over my head and my company for the rest of my life. To truly survive this, the victory had to be absolute. It had to be a spectacular, undeniable public flip. I needed the entire fake narrative Aubrey had spent months building to violently collapse onto itself right here in this exact room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, directly in front of the exact same reporters she had so masterfully manipulated today. The trap Graham was building had to spring shut with such overwhelming, irrefutable force that no one in this town, or in my industry, would ever dare question the legitimate origin of my fortune again. When court reconvened on the morning of the second day, the heavy anticipation in the room had curdled into something far more dangerous. The gallery was packed even tighter than the day before, filled with people hungry for the continuation of yesterday's emotional bloodbath. They expected more tears. They expected more tragic tales of a broken sisterhood. Instead, Graham stepped up to the podium and methodically began to strip the fresh paint right off Aubrey's carefully constructed masterpiece. He did not begin with a fiery opening statement. He signaled the court clerk to activate the large digital display monitor positioned directly across from the jury box. Though this was a bench trial decided solely by Judge Wainwright, Graham projected a series of stark, meticulously organized financial aggregation charts. The first graphic was a towering, undeniable visual representation covering exactly 12 years of relentless financial hemorrhaging. It detailed the massive, uninterrupted pipeline of capital flowing directly from our parents' secure accounts into the gaping black hole of my sister's catastrophic lifestyle. The sheer scale of the numbers, when laid out year after year, provoked an audible gasp from the reporters sitting in the back row. Graham did not merely show the major business bailouts. He exposed the quiet, hidden debt forgiveness. He highlighted the premium car leases quietly paid off, the luxury vacation debts erased, and the private club membership secretly maintained to keep up her wealthy facade. Aubrey sat stiffly at the plaintiff table, realizing that the cold mathematics were completely destroying her narrative of being a financially exiled outcast. She immediately shifted her strategy. When Graham called her back to the stand to verify the ledgers, she abandoned her gentle, weeping victim persona. She became defensive and sharp. She aggressively insisted that every single transfer was simply an act of standard familial support. She looked directly at the judge and confidently declared that in a truly loving household, parents do not keep a running tally of their affection. She swore under oath that absolutely no one in our family ever utilized the term inheritance advancement when handing her those checks. She claimed it was all just unconditional help, and that retroactively labeling those gifts as debt was a malicious tactic designed solely by me to cheat her out of her rightful share of the estate today. Graham did not argue with her logic. He simply let her words hang in the silent air, then dismissed her from the stand and immediately called our forensic auditor. The auditor was an incredibly poised woman who spoke with the precise, unyielding cadence of a federal investigator. For the next 2 hours, she systematically dismantled the absolute core of the plaintiff's lawsuit. Richard Vance attempted to object multiple times, trying to disrupt her flow, but the auditor remained completely unfazed. She walked the court through a flawless digital reconstruction of my corporate history. She testified, with absolute professional certainty, that my technology firm had never received a single dollar, neither directly nor indirectly, from the family trust. She traced my initial startup capital back to my own grueling contract work and personal savings. With surgical precision, she severed the imaginary financial umbilical cord Aubrey had spent months trying to tie between my empire and our parents' legacy. The destruction of their primary legal argument left the plaintiff's table visibly shaken, but Graham was far from finished. He introduced a surprise witness that sent a sudden, visible tremor through Aubrey's posture. He called our mother's former personal assistant to the stand. For nearly 10 years, this quiet, highly observant woman had managed the complex daily schedule of our household. She knew exactly who was in the room during every major family crisis. Under Graham's careful questioning, the assistant calmly confirmed that Aubrey was completely lying about being shut out of the family's financial decisions. She described, in vivid detail, multiple private meetings held in our parents' home office. She painted a crystal-clear picture of Aubrey's true demeanor during those highly sensitive discussions. Aubrey was never the fragile, neglected daughter she claimed to be. The assistant testified that Aubrey was consistently impatient, highly irritable, and deeply annoyed by the formal legal processes. She recounted how my sister would sit at the heavy wooden desk, constantly checking her expensive phone, rolling her eyes at the estate attorneys, and loudly complaining about having to read the boring legal jargon before rushing to sign whatever documents were placed in front of her. Sitting directly across from the witness stand, Aubrey began to rapidly lose control of her meticulously curated image. Her pristine facade cracked right down the middle. She let out a loud, mocking scoff that echoed sharply through the quiet room, interrupting the assistant's testimony. Judge Wainwright instantly slammed his gavel, his voice cracking like a whip as he strictly admonished her for the outburst. Barely 5 minutes later, Aubrey abruptly buried her face in her hands and began to sob loudly, attempting to pivot back to her fragile victim role. This chaotic, erratic swing between aggressive, entitled mockery and theatrical weeping was a catastrophic error. I watched Judge Wainwright peer over his reading glasses, his deep-set eyes locked onto my sister. He was no longer looking at a grieving daughter. He was finally witnessing the volatile, manipulative instability that our parents had been forced to navigate for decades. Despite inflicting these massive blows to her credibility, Graham did something incredibly dangerous. He deliberately held back our most lethal piece of evidence. He concluded his morning session without ever mentioning the final waiver agreement. This calculated omission created a brilliant, highly deceptive illusion for the opposing counsel. Richard Vance visibly relaxed his shoulders. Aubrey wiped her tears and sat a little taller. They genuinely believed that Graham had reached the absolute bottom of his defensive arsenal. They thought our only strategy was to make Aubrey look like a spoiled, irresponsible burden, but that we lacked the ultimate legal mechanism to permanently terminate her rights to the estate. They mistakenly felt they were surviving the worst of the storm. When the court reconvened after the mandatory midday recess, that false sense of security fueled a staggering act of hubris. Vance put Aubrey back on the witness stand for a redirect examination, desperately attempting to repair the severe damage done to her character. He wanted her to explicitly clarify her financial relationship with our mother during those final, chaotic months. Emboldened by the belief that we had no further documentary evidence to trap her with, Aubrey leaned closely into the microphone. She wanted to deliver a powerful, definitive soundbite for the reporters scribbling in the back. Without any prompting, she made a sweeping, absolute declaration under the strict penalty of perjury. She stated, in a loud and unwavering voice, that she had never, at any point in her entire life, received any form of a final estate distribution. She boldly looked Judge Wainwright directly in the eye and swore that if there was ever any piece of paper bearing her signature that claimed she had waived her future rights to the family fortune, she was absolutely tricked, maliciously coerced, or entirely set up by a fraudulent scheme orchestrated by her younger sister. The heavy air in the courtroom seemed to instantly solidify. Graham did not raise an objection. He did not loudly interrupt her. He did not even look up from his blank yellow notepad. I kept my hands perfectly still, resting gently on the cool leather of my briefcase. Neither of us displayed a single ounce of reaction. But the absolute gravity of her words resonated deeply with anyone in that room who truly understood the lethal, unforgiving rhythm of a high-stakes legal cross-examination. My sister had just confidently sprinted past the point of no return. She did not merely tell another lie to generate public sympathy. She had just firmly planted her own feet inside a massive perjury trap. She had forcefully knocked her head against a solid steel door, loudly challenging the existence of a document she believed had been lost to time. In that very second, the long, exhausting battle of the trial officially came to an end. Now, the rest of the entire proceeding was simply a matter of waiting for the absolute perfect moment to push the final key into the lock and let the trap snap shut. The heavy Florida rain was beating relentlessly against the towering, floor-to-ceiling windows of my private study when the doorbell finally rang at exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. It was Graham. He did not look like a man who had just spent the entire day dismantling a hostile witness in a high-stakes civil trial. He looked intensely focused, carrying a severely weathered cardboard file box tightly under his arm. He walked straight past the grand foyer and set the damp, heavy box down on my polished mahogany desk. He explained that a private courier had just dropped it off at his law firm a few hours ago. The sender was our mother's former financial advisor, a meticulous man who had retired to a quiet coastal town roughly 3 years prior. He had been closely watching the sensationalized evening news coverage of the trial and immediately recognized the catastrophic lie my sister was attempting to legitimize in front of the cameras. Recognizing the danger, he went deep into his private, climate-controlled storage archives and retrieved the one physical box our parents had entrusted to him for this exact terrifying scenario. The cardboard was brittle, smelling faintly of old paper, dust, and time. Graham stepped back, respectfully allowing me to break the heavy packing tape myself. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, resting perfectly centered on top of a thick stack of old accounting ledger books, was a single, immaculately preserved cream-colored envelope. The heavy parchment paper felt strangely cold against my fingertips as I pulled it out into the light. I turned it over under the warm, focused glow of the desk lamp. Written across the front, in the sharp, unmistakable, and violently precise handwriting of my late father, was a single, chilling directive: to be opened only if Aubrey contests after accepting final advancement. It was a message sent directly from the grave, a testament to the frightening foresight of a man who knew his eldest daughter infinitely better than she knew herself. He had anticipated her greed, calculated her inevitable betrayal, and prepared the perfect, lethal countermeasure years before his heart finally gave out. My hands were entirely steady as I slid a brass letter opener cleanly beneath the sealed flap. I pulled the dense contents out and spread them carefully across the smooth surface of the desk. Graham leaned in closely, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. It was not merely the original, notarized legal agreement that Aubrey had sworn under strict penalty of perjury did not exist. That single document alone would have been enough to destroy her entire case and subject her to severe judicial sanctions. But our parents had been remarkably thorough in their defensive architecture. Attached securely to the back of the heavy legal contract was a handwritten addendum penned by our mother. meticulously detailing the exact nature and staggering dollar amount of the final financial rescue. And beneath that, fastened tightly with a silver paperclip, was a thin stack of printed digital correspondence. It was a chain of emails sent exactly 5 days before the final, fateful family meeting took place. I began to read the top email, and the sheer audacity of the printed words actually made the breath catch in my throat. The exchange was not a conversation between my parents and Aubrey. It was a direct, highly confidential communication between Aubrey and the independent legal counsel she had privately retained that specific year. In these private messages, she was not the desperate, confused, and heavily manipulated victim she had been pretending to be on the witness stand. She was aggressively dictating her selfish demands to her own lawyer. She explicitly wrote that she needed to take the massive lump sum of money immediately to save her sinking luxury event business from imminent bankruptcy. But the most damning, explosive sentence was buried halfway down the second paragraph. She clearly instructed her attorney to push the final deal through as quickly as possible, stating in plain text that she wanted to take the cash right now and let McKinley hug that profoundly boring pile of family assets. She wrote, in her own arrogant words, that she deeply preferred immediate cash over the heavy, suffocating burden of long-term stewardship. Graham read the sentence out loud, the quiet acoustics of my study amplifying the devastating, heavy weight of the words. This printed email completely obliterated every single foundational pillar of her tearful courtroom performance. It proved, beyond any shadow of a legal or moral doubt, that at the exact moment she signed away her future inheritance, Aubrey was completely lucid, highly calculating, and acting under the direct, paid guidance of her own legal counsel. She knew exactly what she was giving up, and she gleefully chose the immediate financial gratification over the long-term familial responsibility. She had not been tricked by a younger sister. She had not been coerced by a dying mother. She had actively orchestrated her own permanent exit from the family trust because she found the concept of building and preserving wealth completely repulsive compared to the intoxicating thrill of spending it immediately. I looked up at Graham and asked him if we should file an emergency late-night evidentiary motion with the court clerk to end the trial immediately. A slow, deeply dangerous smile spread across his face, and he shook his head firmly. He explained the psychology of the battlefield. He told me that submitting the evidence into the electronic docket tonight would trigger an automatic digital notification to opposing counsel. Richard Vance would read it, instantly realize his client had committed massive, undeniable perjury, and he would desperately file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit before the courthouse doors even opened. He would attempt to quietly pull the plug on the entire spectacle in the dark to save her from a devastating public humiliation and potential criminal charges. Graham reached across the desk, gathered the original contract, the handwritten addendum, and the fatal printed emails, and slid them into a brand-new, crisp, cream-colored envelope. He sealed it tightly. He told me that we were going to walk this directly into the courtroom tomorrow morning and hand it to the judge while Aubrey was sitting right there, still wearing her pathetic mask of tragic victimhood. We were going to maximize the absolute legal and psychological destruction. After Graham left, the large house felt overwhelmingly quiet. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom, but I did not even bother turning down the bedsheets. I stood by the large window, watching the relentless rain wash over the dark streets, completely wide awake. I was not losing sleep because I was afraid of the judge's impending ruling. The fear of losing my hard-earned fortune had entirely evaporated the exact moment I saw my father's handwriting on that old paper. I was wide awake because I fully understood the profound magnitude of what the morning would inevitably bring. Tomorrow was no longer just about protecting my bank accounts, my commercial real estate, or the massive equity in my technology firm. It was about an ultimate, violent reckoning of the truth. Tomorrow would permanently decide, in the unforgiving eyes of the media, the business community, and the eternal public record, exactly who had been lying systematically since the very beginning of this nightmare. It was the long, heavy night before a public execution, and the executioner was simply a piece of paper waiting in the dark. When the sun finally rose, burning off the heavy morning fog that blanketed the coastal city, I dressed in a sharp, structured charcoal suit. I walked down the grand staircase and stopped in the foyer. Normally, preparing for a high-stakes litigation day meant hauling a massive, heavy leather briefcase stuffed with hundreds of pages of defensive exhibits, banking ledgers, and printed affidavits. I looked at my heavy black bag sitting by the front door and simply walked right past it. I did not need the thick armor anymore. When I finally walked through the heavy oak doors of the county courthouse and stepped into the chaotic, buzzing energy of the final trial day, my hands were almost entirely empty. I did not bring the thick binders. I did not bring the heavy financial summaries. I walked down the center aisle of the packed courtroom carrying nothing but a single, incredibly thin, cream-colored envelope. It looked so entirely fragile, so profoundly weightless, that absolutely no one in that loud, crowded room could have possibly suspected it contained enough explosive force to completely shatter a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and a lifetime of lies into a million unrecognizable pieces. The final morning of the trial began exactly how the plaintiff intended. Aubrey was back on the witness stand, delivering her grand finale. She looked directly at Judge Wainwright and, with a perfectly manufactured tremble in her voice, reiterated the core foundation of her entire lawsuit. She explicitly swore, for the third time under the strict penalty of perjury, that she had never received any final distribution from the family estate. She claimed she was cast out into the cold with absolutely nothing, left to fend for herself while I greedily hoarded the entire legacy. As her lawyer, Richard Vance finished his highly emotional redirect examination and proudly took his seat. The gallery murmured in sympathetic agreement. They were completely sold on her performance. Then, Graham Vale slowly stood up from our defense table. He did not carry a thick, intimidating legal binder. He did not ask his paralegals to wheel in a heavy cart loaded with financial exhibits. He held only the thin, cream-colored envelope I had brought with me that morning. He held it loosely, walking toward the center of the room with the calm, terrifying patience of a man who knows the war is already won. Graham cleared his throat, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy, humid silence of the room. He formally requested permission from the bench to submit a single, newly recovered piece of physical documentary evidence directly to His Honor. Richard Vance immediately shot up from his chair to object, his voice loud and panicked, arguing fiercely about late submissions, discovery rules, and procedural fairness. But Graham smoothly countered, his tone perfectly even, stating that this specific document was only discovered late last night in the deep archives of a retired financial advisor. More importantly, Graham noted, its contents directly and unequivocally impeached the sworn testimony the plaintiff had just delivered to the court mere seconds ago. Judge Wainwright stared down at Graham, his expression incredibly stern and unreadable. He looked at the frantic opposing counsel, then back to Graham. The judge overruled the objection with a sharp wave of his hand and gestured for the bailiff to approach. The uniformed officer walked across the well of the court, took the fragile envelope from Graham, and handed it high up to the heavy wooden bench. The entire courtroom fell so incredibly silent that you could vividly hear the sharp, distinct sound of heavy parchment paper being torn open by the judge. It was a small sound, but in that tense atmosphere, it echoed like a gunshot. Judge Wainwright slid the folded documents out into the open. He carefully adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the top page. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table, watching the judge closely. For the first 30 seconds, his face was an absolute mask of judicial neutrality. Then, his thick gray eyebrows slowly began to rise. A heavy, palpable shift occurred in the room. The air felt suddenly thinner. He was looking directly at the original family advancement and final waiver agreement. Judge Wainwright began to read aloud for the official court record, detailing exactly what the legal document was. He noted, with a voice growing increasingly hard, that it bore the clear, notarized signature of Aubrey Silva. He read the full name of the independent legal counsel who had represented her on that exact day. He listed the signatures of the state-appointed notary public and the 2 independent witnesses who had watched her sign away her future. Richard Vance froze completely at his table. The confident color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly pale. He slowly turned his head to look at his client, his eyes wide with professional horror. In that exact second, the high-priced litigation attorney realized that his weeping, fragile client had aggressively and repeatedly lied to him from the very beginning of their professional relationship. Judge Wainwright did not stop there. He turned the page to the handwritten addendum securely attached to the back of the contract. His booming voice echoed through the shocked courtroom as he read the meticulously itemized list of every single advancement my sister had previously received. He read out the staggering sums of money used to rescue her failing luxury condominium from immediate foreclosure. He listed the massive capital injections that paid off her terrifying federal tax debts, the seed money completely lost in her ruined retail boutique, and the emergency funds that covered her disastrous event planning business. Finally, he read the ultimate clause detailing the massive, unconditional lump sum of cash she received on that exact day in direct exchange for fully and permanently waiving all future claims against the family trust and my personal assets. Aubrey gripped the wooden edges of the witness stand. Her knuckles turned completely white. Her perfectly glossed mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The delicate, tragic mask she had worn for days was melting right off her face in front of the entire county. Before she could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse or shed another fake tear, Judge Wainwright pulled the final piece of paper from the stack. It was the printed email thread. The judge leaned forward over the bench, his eyes locking directly onto Aubrey like a hawk spotting prey. He read her own arrogant words back to her. He read her aggressive demand for cash right now. He read her crude, heartless complaint about refusing to wait for her parents to pass away just to get her financial share. And then, he read the final, condemning sentence where she eagerly agreed to let me retain full management of the remaining estate because she felt that I simply enjoyed doing those profoundly boring things. Right at that exact moment, the courtroom experienced something truly rare. Judge Wainwright let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was not joyful. It was the sheer, incredulous laugh of a seasoned jurist who had spent decades presiding over complex civil disputes and had just witnessed a plaintiff utterly destroy her own elaborate case with her own written confession, completely contradicting days of weeping on the stand. It was the sound of the ultimate trap snapping shut. Complete panic consumed Aubrey. She looked wildly at the frantic reporters in the back row, then turned desperately to her lawyer, pleading with her eyes. She started stammering into the microphone, frantically claiming that she simply did not remember signing anything, that she was under immense stress, that the email was entirely taken out of context. But Graham was entirely merciless. He stepped right up to the podium and delivered the final, fatal sequence of blows. He produced the accompanying bank transfer logs, showing the exact moment the massive cash settlement hit her personal account. He submitted the signed receipt of funds confirmation. He handed over the official meeting minutes clearly showing her private attorney was sitting right next to her when the ink dried on the contract. The sheer mountain of irrefutable documentary evidence completely crushed her. There was absolutely nowhere left for her to run, no emotional narrative left to spin, and no one left in the room who believed a single word she said. Judge Wainwright did not even require a standard recess to deliberate his ruling. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a deafening crack. He declared in a voice like thunder that the plaintiff possessed absolutely no legal right, claim, or standing regarding the family trust or any of my personal corporate holdings. He stated for the permanent public record that Aubrey had deliberately and maliciously attempted to defraud the court, willfully destroying her own credibility by providing sworn testimony that violently contradicted her own signed legal agreements. The lawsuit was dismissed in its absolute entirety, with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, Judge Wainwright aggressively ordered that the plaintiff would be held entirely responsible for covering all of my extensive legal fees and court costs, leaving her facing financial ruin of her own making. The courtroom immediately erupted into absolute chaos. The reporters scrambled aggressively for the heavy wooden doors to file their breaking stories, realizing the tragic victim they had been writing about all week was actually the ruthless villain of her own manufactured drama. Aubrey sat entirely frozen in the witness chair, completely isolated, her fake empire of victimhood shattered beyond repair. Her own lawyer was already packing his briefcase, refusing to even look at her. I stood up slowly from the defense table. I did not cheer loudly. I did not smile triumphantly at my sister. The victory did not require any loud, arrogant celebration. It was a cold, absolute validation of reality. Graham walked over, a look of profound professional satisfaction on his face, and quietly handed the empty cream-colored envelope back to me. Holding that light, fragile piece of paper in my hands, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I finally understood exactly what my parents had truly left behind. They did not just leave me a mountain of money or a highly successful corporate portfolio. They left me a perfectly engineered system. They left me an impenetrable legal shield. They taught me the ultimate, enduring lesson about dealing with entitled, greedy people. The thing that destroys them the fastest is never the cruelty of their enemies. It is the undeniable permanence of the signature they arrogantly signed when they mistakenly thought they were the smartest person in the room. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.